In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that few dare to acknowledge: belonging is not a birthright, but a choice made by those brave enough to see beyond the surface. When the universe turns its back on you, when your own kind cast you out for daring to be different, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, a species that others consider primitive, violent, and utterly beneath notice. This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our weapons, or our conquest of the stars. It's something far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous to those who would oppress: our willingness to stand with the broken, the outcast, and the forgotten. Because when humans decide someone belongs, the entire galaxy learns what it truly means to face a species that refuses to abandon those they've chosen to protect. Some call it foolishness. Others call it weakness. But those who have experienced it firsthand know the truth: there is nothing more terrifying in the universe than a human who has decided your family. Of the rain on Kepler station fell in perfect geometric patterns, each drop precisely calculated by atmospheric processors to maintain optimal humidity levels throughout the sprawling space station. Zara pressed her face against the observation deck's transparent steel window, watching the artificial weather system work its magic over the station's central park. Her reflection stared back at her violet skin marked with the distinctive silver patterns of her people, the Veltar, but dulled now by exhaustion and something deeper: shame. Another human transport just docked, whispered Kes, one of the few Veltar who still acknowledged her existence. The younger female approached cautiously, as if Zara's condition might be contagious. Base 17. I heard they're taking on passengers for the Outer Rim territories. Zara didn't turn from the window. 3 cycles had passed since the conclave of elders had stripped her of her family name, her citizenship, and her right to walk among her own people. 3 cycles since they'd declared her thoughts too alien, her questions too dangerous, her very existence a threat to the purity of Veltar culture. The formal term they'd used was Kethmiran, literally meaning one who walks with shadows, but everyone knew what it really meant. Exile. Why do you tell me this? Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The translator implant at her throat converted her words into standard galactic, though Kes would understand her native tongue just fine. Because, Kes glanced around nervously, ensuring none of the other Veltar in the observation lounge could overhear, because maybe it's time to stop waiting for forgiveness that will never come. The words hit harder than Zara expected. For 3 cycles, she'd remained on Kepler station, subsisting on the charity of aliens who pitied her situation, holding on to the desperate hope that her people would reconsider. That somehow, the elders would realize their mistake and welcome her home. But Kes was right. The Veltar didn't change their minds. They never had, not in their 12,000-year recorded history. Humans, Zara said, finally, turning from the window. You're suggesting I seek passage with humans? Kes nodded, though her expression remained troubled. They're the only ones who don't ask questions about why someone needs to disappear. And they don't care about your species' politics. She paused, then added quietly, plus, I heard they actually pay their passengers if they're willing to work during the journey. Not much, but enough to start over somewhere new. Zara had observed humans during her time on the station, though always from a distance. They were strange creatures, shorter than most sapient species, lacking any of the natural weapons or armor that evolution typically favored, and possessing what the galactic community generally considered to be primitive emotional responses. They felt things too deeply, the scholars said. They formed attachments too quickly. They were unpredictable, sometimes violent, and definitely not to be trusted with serious responsibilities. Yet they were also the only species that had never refused her service in their establishments. The only ones who didn't seem to recognize or care about the mark of exile that other species could apparently smell on her from across a room. What do you know about them? Zara asked. Not much, Kes admitted. They're relatively new to the galactic community. Only made first contact about 50 of their years ago. Most species consider them too aggressive for proper civilization, but they're excellent traders and their ships are remarkably reliable. She hesitated. And I've heard stories. What kind of stories? That they don't abandon their own. Ever. Even when it would be practical to do so. Kes's voice dropped even lower. There was an incident about 10 cycles ago. A human exploration vessel was attacked by Krogan pirates. Instead of writing off the crew as lost, every human ship in 3 sectors converged on the Krogan position. They didn't negotiate. They didn't offer ransom. They simply came for their people. Zara had heard whispers of this story before, though the details varied depending on who told it. The Krogans certainly never spoke of it, and the few human accounts she'd encountered were frustratingly short on specifics. But the underlying message was always the same: humans protected their own with a ferocity that made even the galaxy's warrior races uncomfortable. "That's all very interesting," Zara said carefully, "but I'm not human. Why would they care what happens to an exile?" "Maybe they won't," Kes acknowledged. "But maybe they're the kind of people who judge you by who you are now, not who your species says you should be." The idea was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Zara had spent her entire life trying to fit into the rigid social structure of Veltar society, following rules that seemed to exist solely to prevent change or growth. What would it be like to be around people who didn't already know exactly what they expected from her? "Bay 17, she repeated. "The ship is called the Wanderer's Hope. Captain Marcus Chen, according to the station registry. They're scheduled to depart in 6 hours. Kes placed a small data pad on the table between them. I took the liberty of checking their route. They're heading for the frontier systems, places where old names and old shame don't follow you." Zara picked up the datapad, noting that Kes had already loaded it with her personal information and what little remained of her possessions. Her friend had been planning this conversation, she realized. "Perhaps for some time." "You really think I should go?" "I think you should live," Kes said simply. "And I don't think you can do that here. Not anymore." Looking around the observation lounge, Zara saw the familiar sight of various galactic species conducting their business, negotiating deals, planning journeys. None of them looked at her directly, but she could feel their awareness of her presence like a constant weight. The exile. The one who didn't belong. "What will you tell the others?" Zara asked. "That you finally came to your senses and left to spare them further embarrassment," Kes replied with a bitter smile. "They'll be relieved." The honesty of it stung, but Zara was grateful for it. Better to face the truth than continue living in denial. She stood, tucking the data pad into her travel pouch. "Kes," she began, not sure how to express her gratitude. "Don't," her friend said, raising a hand. "Just be careful. Humans may not care about our politics, but that doesn't mean they're harmless. They're still aliens, with alien ways of thinking. Promise me you won't assume they're safe just because they're different from us." Zara nodded, understanding the concern. But, as she made her way through the station's corridors toward Base 17, she couldn't help but wonder if different might be exactly what she needed. The human section of Kepler Station was immediately obvious to anyone with functioning sensory organs. Where other species favored sterile, efficient designs that maximized function while minimizing unnecessary elements, the humans had somehow managed to make their area feel warm. There was no other word for it. Soft lighting that actually resembled natural sunlight, plants growing in what appeared to be decorative arrangements, and sounds that took Zara a moment to identify as music. It was chaotic compared to the orderly sections maintained by more established galactic species, but there was something appealing about the organized disorder. Something that suggested people actually lived here, rather than simply existing. Base 17 housed a ship that looked exactly like what Zara had expected from human engineering: functional, sturdy, and completely uninterested in aesthetics. The Wanderer's Hope was a mid-sized cargo vessel with obvious modifications for passenger transport. It wasn't beautiful by any standard Zara knew, but it radiated the kind of reliability that came from regular use and careful maintenance. A human male stood near the ship's loading ramp, consulting a data slate while occasionally glancing at the station's chronometer. He was average height for his species, with dark hair and the kind of weathered features that suggested considerable time spent in space. When he noticed Zara approaching, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked in standard galactic, though his accent was distinctly human. "I'm looking for Captain Chen," Zara replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I understand you might have passenger accommodations available." "That's me," the man said, extending his hand in what Zara recognized as a human greeting gesture. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out to complete the ritual, noting the warmth and firmness of his grip. "Marcus Chen. You're Veltar, right?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Most species would dance around such observations, particularly when dealing with someone who was clearly displaced from their normal social context. "Yes," she said simply. "Don't see many of your people out here in the independent sectors," Marcus observed, but without the judgment Zara had learned to expect. "What's your destination?" Zara realized she hadn't actually thought that far ahead. "I need to get away from here. Somewhere new. Somewhere I can start over." Marcus studied her for a moment, and Zara had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she'd intended to reveal. "Running from something or towards something?" The question was blunt but not unkind. And something about the way he asked it made Zara think he might actually understand the difference. "Away," she said honestly. "Fair enough. That's how most of us end up out here anyway." Marcus gestured toward the ship. "I've got one passenger cabin still available. Basic accommodations, but clean and private. Trip to the Meridian sector will take about 3 weeks, with stops at 4 different systems. You can get off anywhere along the way, or ride it to the end if you're still figuring things out." "How much?" Zara asked, though she suspected her remaining credits wouldn't be sufficient for proper passage. "Depends," Marcus said. "You willing to work for part of your fare?" "What kind of work?" "Nothing specialized. General maintenance, cargo handling, maybe help in the galley if you can manage human food preparation. My regular crew can handle the technical stuff, but extra hands are always useful." He paused. "You seem like someone who's used to earning her way." There was something in his tone that suggested approval rather than mere practicality. As if choosing to work rather than simply pay was somehow the better option. "I can work," Zara said. "What would that reduce the fare to?" "How about we make it simple," Marcus said. "You work your passage, I provide food and accommodation. If you decide to stay on past Meridian, we can discuss longer-term arrangements." The offer was so generous that Zara immediately suspected a trap. "Why would you do that?" Marcus shrugged. "Because you look like you could use a break, and I could use the help. Sometimes things don't have to be more complicated than that." It was such a human response that Zara almost smiled. Any other species would have required contracts, background checks, and formal guarantees. Humans, apparently, operated on something closer to instinct. "When do you depart?" she asked. 4 hours. That enough time to get your affairs in order? Zara thought about her sparse belongings, her lack of affairs to put in order, and the empty life she was leaving behind on Kepler Station. "That's more than enough time," she said. "Good." Marcus handed her a small device. "This will get you into the ship and show you to your quarters. Dinner's at 1900 hours, ship time. We'll introduce you to the rest of the crew then, ... He paused, then added, "Welcome aboard the Wanderer's Hope." As Zara walked up the loading ramp, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 cycles: hope. Maybe Kess had been right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for forgiveness and start looking for somewhere new to belong. The ship's interior was as functional as its exterior, but there were small touches that made it feel less sterile than most vessels Zara had traveled on. Pictures that appeared to be personal photos rather than standard decorations. Comfortable chairs that showed signs of regular use. A coffee station that smelled invitingly of something rich and warm. Her quarters were small but well-designed, with a sleeping alcove, a small desk, and what humans called a viewport, a window that looked out into space. It wasn't luxury, but it was private, clean, and hers for as long as she needed it. For the first time since her exile began, Zara allowed herself to imagine a future that might be worth living. She didn't know where she was going or what she would find there, but she was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. The Wanderer's Hope shuddered slightly as its engines came online, and Zara felt the subtle shift that indicated they were moving away from the station. Away from everything she had known, and toward something completely unknown. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like freedom. The first thing Zara learned about humans was that they were impossibly loud. Not in terms of volume, though they were certainly more vocal than her own people, but in terms of presence. They filled spaces in a way that had nothing to do with their physical size and everything to do with their personalities. After a lifetime among the Veltar, where conversation was formal and emotional expression was carefully controlled, being around humans felt like standing in the middle of a controlled hurricane. "Pass the protein paste, would you?" called out Lynn Rodriguez, the ship's engineer, reaching across the galley table with casual familiarity. "And, somebody tell Jackson he's burning the vegetables again." "I'm not burning anything," Jackson Turner protested from his position at the cooking station. "I'm giving them character." "Character is what we call food that's gone bad," added Sarah Kim, the ship's pilot. "What you're doing is called creating a fire hazard." Zara sat at the edge of the group, still uncertain of her place in this chaotic dinner ritual. It had been 3 days since they left Kepler Station, and she was beginning to understand that humans didn't just share meals, they performed them. Every dinner was an opportunity for storytelling, debate, friendly insults, and what they called catching up even though they'd been working together all day. "So Zara," Captain Chen said, settling into his chair with a plate of Jackson's allegedly overcooked vegetables, "how are you settling in? Nobody giving you trouble about the cargo handling?" "No trouble," Zara replied honestly. The work was straightforward, and the crew had been patient with her unfamiliarity with human equipment. "Though I don't understand why you store emergency supplies in 17 different locations throughout the ship." "Redundancy," Lynn explained, waving her fork for emphasis. "Humans learned a long time ago that putting all your important stuff in one place is a great way to lose all your important stuff at once. Most species achieve redundancy through advanced engineering," Zara pointed out. "Multiple independent systems serving the same function." "Yeah, well, most species didn't spend their early spacefaring years getting blown up by everything from solar flares to hostile aliens," Sarah said with a grin. "We learned to be paranoid the hard way." "Is that why your ship has so many manual override systems?" Zara asked. She'd noticed during her work that virtually every automated function on the Wanderer's Hope could be operated manually if necessary. "It seems inefficient." "Inefficient, maybe," Captain Chen acknowledged. "But, when your life support decides to take a vacation, you'll be glad we can fix it with basic tools and human stubbornness." The conversation moved on to other topics: a supply run that had gone sideways on their last trip, speculation about cargo prices at their next destination, an ongoing argument about whether Jackson's attempts at cooking could legally be classified as food. Zara found herself listening with growing fascination, not so much to the words as to the way they spoke to each other. There was no hierarchy in their conversation despite Chen clearly being the captain. No formal protocols or careful deference to social status. They interrupted each other, disagreed openly, and seemed to consider mild insults a form of entertainment. It was chaotic and inefficient and completely unlike anything Zara had experienced with her own people. It was also oddly comforting. "Question for you," Sarah said, turning to address Zara directly. "What's the deal with your people and those formal greeting rituals? We had a Veltar passenger about a year ago, and every conversation started with this 10-minute ceremony about family names and social position. Took forever to get anything done." Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with any mention of Veltar customs, but forced herself to answer. The greeting rituals establish proper social context for the interaction. They ensure that everyone understands their relative status and can communicate appropriately. "Sounds exhausting," Jackson observed. "It's efficient," Zara said, though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them anymore. "It prevents misunderstandings and social errors." "Does it, though?" Lynn asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "I mean, if everyone's spending so much time figuring out how they're supposed to talk to each other, when do you actually get around to talking?" The question hit harder than Lynn had probably intended. How much of Zara's life had been spent navigating social protocols rather than actually connecting with others? How many conversations had she never had because the ritual of beginning them was too complex to bother with? "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I never thought about it that way." "That's the thing about growing up inside a system," Captain Chen said, his voice gentler than the others. Sometimes you can't see it clearly until you step outside it. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, and Zara found herself curious about his own background. But, before she could frame a polite question, the ship's communication system chimed with an incoming message. "Probably the station master at Helios Depot confirming our arrival time," Sarah said, reaching for the communication panel. "We should be there in about 6 hours." But, as she read the incoming message, her expression shifted from casual interest to something much more serious. "Captain," she said slowly, "you need to see this." Chen moved to read the message over her shoulder, and Zara watched his face go completely neutral, the kind of careful blankness she'd learned meant humans were fighting strong emotions. "What is it?" Lin asked. "Veltar diplomatic courier is requesting permission to board when we reach Helios Depot," Chen said, his voice carefully controlled. "They're asking about passenger manifests." The words hit Zara like a physical blow. She'd known this moment might come eventually, but she'd hoped to have more time. More distance. More of whatever it was she was trying to find out here in the empty spaces between worlds. "They're looking for me," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Jackson asked, but without judgment. More like he was trying to figure out how much trouble and whether it was the sort they could handle. "I'm an exile," Zara said simply. "My people have declared me Kethmiran, one who walks with shadows. Officially, I no longer exist." "But, if you no longer exist, why are they looking for you?" Sarah asked with the kind of logical directness that Zara was learning was typically human. "Because." Zara struggled to find words that would make sense to aliens. "Because exile isn't enough. Not anymore. There are those among my people who believe that even my continued existence is a threat to our cultural purity." The galley fell silent. When humans went quiet, Zara had learned, it usually meant they were thinking something dangerous. "Captain," Lin said finally, "what's our legal obligation here?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring at the communication display. "Technically, we're required to cooperate with legitimate diplomatic requests from recognized galactic governments." "And, practically?" Sarah asked. "Practically, I don't much care for people who hunt exiles." The simple statement carried a weight that Zara didn't fully understand but could definitely feel. There was something in the captain's voice that suggested this situation had moved beyond legal obligations into something more personal. "You don't understand," Zara said quickly. "If you refuse to cooperate with a Veltar diplomatic request, it could create problems for you with the Galactic Commerce Authority." "They have influence." "Zara," Chen interrupted gently, "let me ask you something. Do you want to go with them?" The question was so direct, so simple, that it caught her completely off guard. Not whether she had a legal obligation to go, or whether it would be diplomatically convenient, or whether her personal preferences mattered in the face of larger political considerations. Just, did she want to go? "No," she whispered. "Then, you're not going," Chen said with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation was over. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is," Jackson said, returning to his cooking as if the matter was settled. "You're crew now. And, we don't hand over crew members to people who want to hurt them." "I'm not crew," Zara protested. "I'm just a passenger working for her fare." "Are you?" Lin asked with a grin. "Because the way I see it, you've been working alongside us for 3 days, eating at our table, and fixing problems when you see them. Sounds like crew to me." Zara looked around the galley at 4 humans who were treating her declaration of exile as nothing more than an interesting piece of personal history. They weren't calculating political ramifications or weighing diplomatic advantages. They were simply deciding to protect someone they'd chosen to consider part of their group. It was incomprehensible. It was irrational. It was the most human thing she'd experienced yet. "You can't just decide I'm crew," she said weakly. "Watch us," Sarah said with a smile that managed to be both warm and slightly dangerous. Captain Chen moved back to the communication station. "Sarah, send a response to the Veltar courier. Tell them our passenger manifest is sealed under Terran maritime privacy laws, and they can file a request for information through proper diplomatic channels if they want details." "Will that work?" Zara asked. "Probably not for long," Chen admitted. But it'll buy us some time to figure out our next move. He turned to face her directly. The question is, what do you want to do? We can help you disappear completely if that's what you're after. New identity, passage to the outer systems, set you up somewhere they'll never find you. Or, Zara sensed there was another option. Or we can help you figure out why they're suddenly so interested in one exile that they're chasing you across the galaxy. The suggestion sent a chill through Zara's system. I don't want to know why. I just want to be left alone. That's fair, Chen said. But, in my experience, when powerful people start hunting someone who's supposed to be harmless, it's usually because that person isn't as harmless as they thought. I'm not dangerous, Zara protested. I asked uncomfortable questions about our social structure. I suggested that maybe we could learn something from other species. That hardly makes me a threat to galactic stability. Maybe not, Lin said thoughtfully, but it might make you a threat to people who profit from keeping things exactly the way they are. The idea had never occurred to Zara. She'd always assumed her exile was about cultural purity and social order. But what if it was about something more practical? What if her questions had threatened something valuable enough that her continued existence was seen as a risk? I need to think, she said. Take all the time you need, Chen said. But think fast. We'll be at Helios Depot in 6 hours, and I'd like to have a plan before we arrive. As the crew dispersed to their various duties, Zara remained in the galley, staring out the viewport at the stars streaming past. For the first time since her exile began, she wasn't running away from something. She was being given the choice to run toward something instead. The question was, what did she want to run toward? 3 hours later, Zara found Captain Chen on the bridge, studying star charts with the focused intensity that humans seem to bring to complex problems. The bridge was quieter than the rest of the ship, with only the gentle hum of engines and the occasional beep from monitoring systems to break the silence. Made a decision, he asked without looking up from his charts. I want to know, Zara said. I want to know why they're hunting me. Chen nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Good. That's the first step toward taking control of your own story. But I don't know how to find out. I'm one exile with no resources and no connections. How am I supposed to investigate anything? You're not one exile, Chen said, finally, looking up to meet her eyes. You're part of a crew now. And one of the things humans are very good at is finding information that other people don't want found. Even if it means making enemies of my people? Chen smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. Zara, if your people wanted to stay on our good side, they probably shouldn't have started hunting our crew members. For the first time since receiving the message about the diplomatic courier, Zara felt something other than fear. She felt anticipation. What do we do first? She asked. First, we survive the next few hours at Helios Depot without getting you captured, Chen said. Then, we start asking the right questions to the right people. And if we find out something dangerous? Then, we decide whether to run or fight, Chen said simply. But, we make that decision together. Outside the viewport, Helios Depot grew larger as they approached, its docking bays and commercial districts sprawling across the surface of a small asteroid. Somewhere on that station, Veltar diplomats were waiting to take her back to a life that no longer wanted her. But, for the first time since her exile began, Zara wasn't facing that threat alone. She had allies now. She had people who had chosen to stand with her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was a very human thing to do. And, maybe, she was beginning to think, that wasn't such a bad thing to be. Helios Depot buzzed with the organized chaos of a frontier trading station. Ships from a dozen different species crowded the docking bays, while traders, smugglers, and legitimate businesspeople mingled in the corridors with the kind of careful politeness that came from everyone being armed and nobody wanting trouble. Zara kept her hood up as she followed Captain Chen through the main commercial district, trying to look like just another passenger on shore leave. The disguise wouldn't fool a determined search, but it might buy them time to complete their business before the Veltar diplomatic team realized she was already on the station. There, Chen said quietly, nodding toward a small establishment tucked between a parts dealer and a food vendor. The sign read Information Exchange in 12 different languages, which was station code 4, Ask no questions, pay in untraceable credits.
You're sure about this? Zara asked as they approached the entrance. Myra's the best information broker in this sector, Chen replied.
If anyone knows why your people are suddenly interested in hunting exiles, it'll be her. The interior of the Information Exchange was deliberately uninviting, dark lighting, uncomfortable furniture, and the kind of background noise that would defeat most surveillance equipment.
A human woman with silver hair and cybernetic eye implants looked up from her terminal as they entered.
Marcus Chen, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Haven't seen you since that business with the Croton smugglers.
I assume you're not here for pleasure. When am I ever here for pleasure?
Chen replied, settling into the chair across from her desk.
I need information, Mira. The kind that might be expensive.
The best kind, Mira said, then turned her attention to Zara. And you must be the reason the Veltar diplomatic team has been asking very pointed questions about passenger manifests. Zara felt her blood chill.
They've been here already? About 2 hours ago, Mira confirmed.
Very formal, very polite, very insistent.
They're looking for a specific individual, though they weren't forthcoming about why. Her cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on Zara's face. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that individual is you. What did you tell them? Chen asked.
Nothing useful, Mira replied with professional pride.
Client confidentiality is the foundation of my business.
But they made it clear that they're prepared to pay very well for information about an exile named Zara Kethvel.
Hearing her full exile name spoken aloud was like a slap.
Zara had tried to avoid thinking about it, but there it was, the formal designation that marked her as someone who no longer belonged anywhere.
How much? Chen asked.
50,000 credits, Mira said, and Zara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach.
That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime.
More than enough to buy information, silence, or cooperation from almost anyone on the station.
That's serious money, Chen observed. Too serious for a simple exile recovery. Exactly what I thought, Mira agreed. So I did a little digging.
She activated a holodisplay that showed a complex web of connections and data streams.
Want to know what I found?
That's why we're here, Zara said, finding her voice despite her fear. 3 weeks ago, there was a major shakeup in the Veltar government. Several members of the Conclave of Elders were removed from their positions, and new leadership was installed. Mira manipulated the display to highlight specific individuals. The new regime is much more conservative than the previous one.
Conservative how? Chen asked.
The kind of conservative that thinks cultural purity should be enforced with military action if necessary, Mira replied grimly. They've been reaching out to several other species about forming what they call a preservation alliance, essentially a coalition dedicated to preventing what they see as dangerous cultural contamination.
Zara stared at the display, trying to process the implications. But that doesn't explain why they're hunting me specifically. I'm just one exile. Are you? Mira asked, manipulating the display again. Because according to my sources, you're not the only one they're looking for.
The holodisplay now showed a list of names, dozens of them, all with the Keth prefix that marked them as exiles.
They're hunting all of us, Zara whispered. Not hunting, Mira corrected. Eliminating.
3 of the names on this list have already been confirmed dead in what were officially reported as accidents or independent criminal actions. The galley went silent except for the hum of the station's life support systems. Chen was staring at the display with the kind of cold focus that Zara was learning meant he was planning something dangerous.
Why, he asked finally. What threat could a bunch of exiles possibly pose?
That's where it gets interesting, Mira said, calling up another set of data. Every exile on this list was banished for the same general offense, questioning traditional Veltar social structures and suggesting possible reforms or alternatives. She paused for effect. And every one of them had been in contact with other species, learning about alternative ways of organizing society.
Understanding crashed over Zara like a cold wave. They think we're contaminated.
They think exposure to alien ideas has made us dangerous to the stability of their society. More than that, Mira continued. I found communications between the new Veltar leadership and several other species expressing similar concerns. There's talk of establishing protocols for dealing with culturally compromised individuals before they can spread dangerous ideas. They want to create a system for hunting down anyone who questions the way things are, Chen said, his voice deadly quiet. Anyone from any species who might threaten the existing power structure. And they're using us as a test case, Zara realized. If they can successfully eliminate the Veltar exiles without significant opposition, they'll know the galactic community will tolerate this kind of action against other dissidents. Mira nodded approvingly. Very good. That's exactly what my analysis suggests. She leaned back in her chair. So the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? Before anyone could answer, the Information Exchange's security system chimed with an incoming priority alert. Mira glanced at her screens, then swore in 3 different languages. What is it? Chen asked. Veltar security team just entered the commercial district, Mira replied, her fingers flying over her controls. 6 individuals, heavy weapons, moving toward the docking bays in a search pattern. She looked up at Zara. I'm guessing they got tired of waiting for diplomatic cooperation. Chen was already standing. How long before they reached the Wanderer's Hope? 20 minutes, maybe less if they split up. Is there another way back to the ship? Zara asked, but Chen was shaking his head. They'll have the obvious routes covered, he said. And even if we make it back, they can just wait us out. We can't leave until we've completed our cargo transfer. So what do we do? Zara asked, fighting down panic. Chen smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. We do something they won't expect. Which is? We go talk to them. Mira laughed, a sound with no humor in it. That's either brilliant or suicidal, Marcus. I'm not sure which. Little of both, probably, Chen admitted. But, here's the thing, they're not here to negotiate. They're here to take Zara back for elimination, and they think they're dealing with a helpless exile and some primitive humans who won't risk trouble with galactic authorities. Aren't we? Zara asked. Not exactly, Chen replied. Mira, I need you to send a message to someone for me. Priority transmission, encrypted. To who? Chen pulled out his personal communicator and transferred a contact file. Admiral Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Force. Myra's cybernetic eye whirred as she processed the information. Chen. As in, related to you? My sister, Chen confirmed. Tell her Marcus needs a favor, and that it involves protecting human shipping lanes from hostile alien interference. You have a sister in the Terran military? Zara asked, suddenly, understanding why Chen had been so confident about taking on galactic authorities. I have a sister who doesn't like bullies, Chen corrected. And who has access to a few ships that might be interested in ensuring the safety of human commercial vessels in this sector. Mira was already composing the message. This is going to cost you, Marcus. Put it on my tab, Chen replied. How long for a response? From a military communications center? 10 minutes, maybe 15. Good. Chen turned to Zara. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk out of here, find the Veltar security team, and have a conversation about their intentions regarding you. A conversation, Zara repeated weakly. A very polite conversation, Chen assured her. The kind where we explain that you're under the protection of human commercial interests, and that any attempt to harm you would be considered an act of piracy against Terran shipping. Will that work? Probably not, Chen admitted. But it'll buy us time for my sister to respond, and it'll put them in the position of having to make the first aggressive move in front of witnesses. And if they make that move? Chen's smile became something genuinely frightening. Then, they learn why most species consider humans too dangerous for polite society. As they prepared to leave the information exchange, Zara found herself caught between terror and a strange sense of anticipation. She'd spent her entire life being told that questioning authority was dangerous, that challenging the established order would lead to disaster.
But, here she was, surrounded by humans who seemed to consider challenging authority a form of entertainment. "Captain," she said as they reached the exit, "what if we're wrong? What if they're just here to take me back for some kind of formal legal proceeding?"
Chen paused, his hand on the door control.
"Zara, in all your time among your people, did anyone ever spend 50,000 credits to locate one exile for a legal proceeding?" She thought about it, then shook her head.
"Then, we're not wrong," Chen said simply. "And that means this stops here, with you, or it continues with every other person who dares to think differently." Outside in the corridor, Zara could hear the sound of heavy footsteps and equipment that suggested armed individuals moving through the station. Somewhere out there, people were hunting her with the intention of ending her life for the crime of asking questions.
But she wasn't alone anymore.
She had allies now, people who had chosen to stand with her not because they had to, but because they believed it was the right thing to do.
"Ready?" Chen asked.
Zara thought about all the times she'd been told to be quiet, to conform, to accept her place without question. She thought about the other exiles who were already dead, and the ones who would die next if this pattern was allowed to continue.
"I'm ready," she said, "and mend it."
They walked out into the corridor to meet their pursuers head-on, and, for the first time in her life, Zara felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The confrontation happened in the main plaza of Helios Depot, surrounded by curious traders and nervous station security. The Veltar team had spread out in a standard search pattern, but when they spotted Zara walking calmly beside Captain Chen, they immediately converged into a more aggressive formation. Zara recognized the leader, Elder Vashti, one of the more conservative members of the conclave who had voted for her exile. He approached with the rigid posture and ceremonial robes that marked him as someone accustomed to absolute deference from his own people. The 5 warriors accompanying him were armed with energy weapons and wore the kind of armor that suggested they weren't planning on taking no for an answer. "Exile Kethvel," Vashti said in formal Veltar, his voice carrying across the plaza with practiced authority. "You will accompany us back to the homeworld to face judgment for your continued crimes against cultural purity." Zara felt the familiar urge to lower her head and submit to authority, a response trained into her from childhood. But then, she felt Chen's presence beside her, calm and unimpressed by the display of formal power. "I'm sorry," Chen said in standard galactic, his voice conversational but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the plaza.
"I don't think we've been properly introduced. Captain Marcus Chen, independent trader and current employer of Ms. Zara."
He deliberately omitted her exile designation.
"And you are?"
The casual tone and deliberate informality clearly threw Vashti off his plan script. "I am Elder Vashti of the Veltar Conclave, and this is a matter of internal Veltar justice that does not concern you." "Actually," Chen replied with a slight smile, "it concerns me quite a bit. You see, Ms. Zara is currently under contract as a member of my crew, which makes her a Terran commercial asset."
"And the Terran Federation takes a very dim view of foreign interference with its commercial operations."
"She is an exile," one of the warriors said, stepping forward aggressively.
"She has no legal protection under any galactic law."
"Funny thing about that," Chen said, pulling out a data pad. "According to Terran maritime law, any individual who signs a work contract with a Terran vessel automatically receives protection under our commercial codes, regardless of their legal status with their species of origin." He held up the pad. "Signed this morning and properly filed with the Terran Commercial Registry." Zara stared at him. They hadn't signed any such contract, but Chen's expression suggested she should play along.
"You cannot simply declare jurisdiction over our internal affairs," Vashti said, though he sounded less certain than before. "Can't I?" Chen asked mildly. "Because last I checked, Helios Depot was neutral territory operating under Galactic Commerce Authority regulations. And those regulations are very clear about protecting registered commercial assets from unlawful seizure."
A small crowd had gathered around the confrontation, including several other human traders who seemed to be taking an unusual interest in the proceedings. Zara noticed them positioning themselves casually but strategically around the plaza, and realized Chen hadn't come to this confrontation unprepared. "This is a legal matter of cultural preservation," Vashti insisted, but his warriors were looking increasingly uncomfortable as more humans appeared in the crowd.
"The exile must return to face the consequences of her contamination."
Contamination, Chen repeated, his voice taking on a harder edge.
That's an interesting word. Are you saying that exposure to other cultures is some kind of disease?
Contact with inferior species corrupts the purity of proper thought, Vashti replied, apparently not realizing how his words would sound to the mixed species crowd around them.
It is a cancer that must be cut out before it spreads. The plaza went completely silent.
Zara could see representatives from at least 6 different species in the crowd, all of whom had just been casually dismissed as inferior. The station's security chief, a Croton who had probably never agreed with a human about anything in his life, was suddenly looking at the Veltar team with obvious hostility.
Well, Chen said into the silence, that's certainly an interesting perspective on galactic relations.
He turned to address the crowd.
Did everyone hear that clearly?
Because I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what's happening here.
We heard, rumbled the Croton security chief. And I'm suddenly very interested in reviewing the weapons permits for these visitors.
Vashti realized his mistake too late.
I did not mean, oh, I think you meant exactly what you said, Chen interrupted. The question is, what are you planning to do about all this contamination you're so worried about?
Before Vashti could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade.
I can answer that.
Everyone turned to see a figure approaching through the crowd, another Veltar, but dressed in simple civilian clothing rather than formal robes or military armor.
Zara gasped as she recognized him.
Jorik, she whispered. Jorik Kathmiran had been one of the first exiles, banished almost 10 cycles ago for proposing educational exchanges with other species. Zara had heard he'd died in the outer systems, but here he was, very much alive and walking with the confidence of someone who had found a new purpose.
Hello, little sister,
Jorik said with a smile that held no trace of the shame that had marked him during his exile ceremony.
I see you found some interesting allies.
You're supposed to be dead, Vashti said, his voice filled with genuine shock.
Yes, well, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Jorik replied cheerfully. Along with the deaths of quite a few other eliminated exiles.
He gestured, and Zara saw more figures emerging from the crowd, Veltar who should have been dead, accompanied by humans, Krogans, and other species she didn't recognize.
Impossible, one of the warriors breathed. Not impossible, said a new voice, and Zara's heart nearly stopped as Admiral Sarachin stepped into the plaza.
She was shorter than her brother but carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding starships.
Just expensive. And, fortunately, the Terran Federation has some very deep pockets when it comes to protecting refugees from political persecution.
The elder Vashti was staring around the plaza with growing horror as he realized the scope of what he was facing. You're interfering with internal Veltar governance. Actually, Admiral Chen said, consulting her own datapad, we're protecting Terran assets and interests. Every exile you've been hunting is now a registered Terran citizen, with full legal protection under our laws. She looked up with a smile that was every bit as dangerous as her brother's. And the Terran Defense Force takes acts of violence against our citizens very seriously indeed. This is illegal, Vashti protested, but his voice lacked conviction.
Is it? Jorik asked.
Because I've spent the last few years learning about something called asylum law, and it turns out most civilized species recognize the right of individuals to seek protection from political persecution. He gestured to the mixed crowd around them.
Amazing what you can learn when you stop assuming your own species knows everything.
You've betrayed everything we stand for, one of the warriors said, his hand moving toward his weapon.
Have we?
Zara found herself speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. Or have we discovered that what we were taught to stand for was never worth standing for in the first place? She stepped forward, away from Chen's protective presence, and faced her former people directly. You call exposure to other species contamination.
You call learning from others corruption.
You're so afraid of change that you're willing to murder anyone who questions whether your way is the only way.
She gestured to the diverse crowd around them. Look around you. These inferior species you're so worried about? They've offered protection, friendship, and belonging to people you threw away.
They've shown more honor in a few weeks than our people showed in my entire lifetime.
You are lost, Vashti said sadly. The contamination has consumed you completely. No, Zara replied firmly. I found myself. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be.
The elder stared at her for a long moment, then activated his communicator.
Command, this is Vashti. The situation here has become complicated. We cannot complete our mission without risking a significant diplomatic incident.
The response was inaudible to the crowd, but Vashti's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. Finally, he deactivated the device and looked around the plaza one more time.
This is not over, he said. The Preservation Alliance will not tolerate this interference indefinitely.
The Preservation Alliance, Admiral Chen repeated thoughtfully.
That's the coalition your new government is forming with other conservative species, isn't it? The one dedicated to preventing cultural contamination? Vashti's silence was answer enough.
Well, Admiral Chen continued, you might want to let them know that the Terran Federation has just filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Commerce Authority regarding systematic persecution of political refugees.
And we've requested a full investigation into this so-called Preservation Alliance and its activities.
You cannot prove anything illegal has occurred.
Maybe not, Marcus Chen said, stepping back into the conversation.
But we can make it very expensive and very public. And we can make sure that every exile who escapes gets protection, support, and a chance to tell their story to anyone willing to listen. The galaxy will learn exactly what your Preservation Alliance is preserving, Jorik added.
And what methods you're willing to use to preserve it.
Vashti looked around the plaza one more time, taking in the hostile faces of multiple species who had just learned about the Veltar attitude toward inferior cultures. The political calculation was written clearly on his face. This confrontation had become a public relations disaster for everything his faction hoped to accomplish.
Come, he said to his warriors. We are leaving.
As the Veltar team withdrew, Admiral Chen moved to stand beside her brother.
You know this isn't over, right? They'll be back, and they'll bring more friends next time.
I know, Marcus replied.
But next time, we'll be ready for them.
And so will everyone else who believes people should have the right to think freely.
The Preservation Alliance will try to spin this as human interference in galactic affairs, Jorik warned. Let them try, Admiral Chen said with a grin that reminded Zara powerfully of her brother. Because we'll spin it as the story of how multiple species came together to protect refugees from political persecution.
And, in the court of public opinion, I like our version better.
As the crowd began to disperse, Zara found herself surrounded by the other rescued exiles.
Some she recognized, others were strangers, but all of them looked at her with the same expression: relief, gratitude, and something that might have been hope.
Welcome to the Resistance, Jorik said quietly. It's not what any of us planned, but it's where we ended up. Resistance? Zara asked.
Against the idea that questioning authority is a crime, Admiral Chen said.
Against the notion that cultures should never change or grow.
Against the fear that makes people hunt down anyone who dares to think differently. Zara looked around at the faces surrounding her: humans, Krogans, fellow Veltar exiles, and others she was only beginning to recognize. They were an impossible mix of species and cultures, united only by their willingness to stand up for what they believed was right.
What happens now? She asked. Now, Marcus Chen said, we go back to the ship and figure out our next move.
Because this was just the beginning. As they walked back toward the docking bays, Zara realized that for the first time since her exile began, she wasn't running away from something. She was running toward something, toward a future where being different wasn't a crime, where asking questions was encouraged rather than punished, and where belonging was something you chose rather than something you were born into.
It was a very human way of thinking about things.
And that, she had learned, was exactly what made it so dangerous to those who preferred the old ways of doing things. 6 months later, Zara stood on the bridge of the Wanderer's Hope, watching as 3 more refugee ships approached their position in the Meridian Nebula. What had started as one human cargo vessel helping a single exile had become something much larger: a network of ships, stations, and safe houses dedicated to protecting anyone fleeing political persecution for their beliefs. Contact from the sanctuary, Sarah Kim reported from the communications station. They've got 17 refugees aboard, including a family of Altarian scholars who were targeted for studying human philosophy.
Human philosophy is considered dangerous now? Jackson asked from his position at the tactical station. He'd been promoted from cook to weapons officer after proving surprisingly effective at what Admiral Chen called aggressive negotiations.
Apparently, the concept of individual rights is considered a contaminating influence, Lynn Rodriguez replied from the engineering console. She was running diagnostics on the ship's new defensive systems upgrades funded by the growing coalition of species that supported their refugee network.
Zara smiled at the easy banter between her crewmates.
It had taken months to stop being surprised by the way humans included her in their casual conversations, but she'd finally learned to think of herself as belonging here. Not as a tolerated exile or grateful passenger, but as an integral part of something important. "Captain," she said, turning to Marcus Chen, "the sanctuary is requesting permission to transfer their refugees to the Meridian Station." "Granted," Chen replied without hesitation. "Signal the station that will need processing facilities for 17 individuals, and ask Dr. Martinez to prepare medical screenings." The Meridian Station had been Admiral Chen's idea, a former mining facility in neutral space, converted into a permanent refuge for political exiles. It wasn't much to look at, but it offered something precious, a place where people could rebuild their lives without fear of being hunted down for their beliefs.
"Signal from Admiral Chen," Sarah reported.
"The Terran delegation to the Galactic Commerce Authority has filed formal charges against the Preservation Alliance for violations of refugee protection laws."
"Will anything come of it?" Zara asked.
"Maybe," Chen said. "But the real victory is that they can't operate in secret anymore. Every time they move against someone, the whole galaxy knows about it."
It was true.
Over the past months, the refugee network had become something neither side had expected, a galactic news story. The idea that multiple species were cooperating to protect political dissidents had captured public imagination in ways that formal diplomatic protests never could. Support was growing, not just from governments but from ordinary citizens who believed that freedom of thought was worth protecting. "Contact from the Veltar border," Lynn announced, her voice suddenly tense.
3 ships on an intercept course. Configuration suggests military escorts. Chen moved to the tactical display. "Are they pursuing the refugees?"
"Negative," Lynn replied after a moment. "They're broadcasting surrender codes." The bridge fell silent. Surrender codes were used when military vessels wanted to defect or seek asylum, but no one had expected Veltar military personnel to abandon their posts.
"Put them through," Chen ordered.
The main screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of a Veltar military vessel. The captain was a female Zara didn't recognize, but her bearing suggested someone accustomed to command.
"This is Captain Sira Velnath of the Veltar Defense Fleet," the woman said in heavily accented Standard Galactic.
"I request permission to join your refugee network."
"Captain Velnath," Chen replied carefully, "you understand that joining us means abandoning your position and, likely, your citizenship?"
"My position was to hunt down and eliminate people whose only crime was asking questions," Velnath replied grimly. "My citizenship is worthless if it requires me to participate in murder." Zara felt her heart racing. A military defection was unprecedented and incredibly dangerous. "Captain," she said quietly, "if Veltar military personnel are defecting, it means the situation at home has gotten much worse."
Chen nodded grimly. "Captain Velnath, what's the current status of the exile elimination program?"
"Accelerated," Velnath replied. "The Preservation Alliance has convinced several species to begin similar purges of their own dissidents.
They're calling it a galaxy-wide cultural purification initiative." She paused. "My ship and crews refuse to participate. We're prepared to provide intelligence about Alliance operations in exchange for protection."
"Intelligence," Chen repeated thoughtfully.
"What kind of intelligence?"
"Locations of planned operations, target lists, ships and personnel involved."
Velnath's expression grew darker. "They're not just hunting exiles anymore.
They're targeting anyone who has helped refugees, anyone who has spoken out against the Alliance, anyone they consider a threat to what they call proper cultural order."
The implications hit Zara like a physical blow. "They're going after their own supporters if they step out of line."
"Exactly," Velnath confirmed. "Including several members of my own crew who questioned the ethics of our orders."
Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical display.
3 Veltar military vessels, requesting asylum and offering intelligence. It was exactly the kind of escalation that could turn their refugee network into something resembling an organized rebellion.
Sarah, he said finally, signal Admiral Chen. Priority 1. Tell her we need to talk about expanding our operational parameters.
Captain, Zara said quietly, are we really prepared for this? What Captain Velnoth is describing, it's not just about protecting refugees anymore.
It's about actively opposing the alliance.
You're right, Chen acknowledged.
This is the decision point.
We can stay small and focus on rescue operations, or we can become something bigger and more dangerous. And more necessary, added Jorik's voice from the communications station. He joined the crew permanently after the Helios Depot incident, serving as a liaison to the exile communities.
Because if the Alliance succeeds in their purification program, there won't be anywhere left for free thinkers to run.
Lin looked up from her console.
Captain, I'm detecting more ships approaching the nebula. Multiple configurations, multiple species.
The tactical display updated to show a dozen vessels converging on their position. Zara recognized the energy signatures of several species, humans, yes, but also Krogans, Altarians, and others she'd never seen working together before. It's not just us anymore, Chen observed with something like wonder in his voice.
Look at that formation. They're coordinating as a fleet.
Admiral Chen's image appeared on the main screen, and, behind her, Zara could see the bridge of a military vessel that was definitely not Terran in design. Marcus, Admiral Chen said without preamble, I'm aboard a Kroden heavy cruiser whose captain is very interested in discussing mutual defense agreements.
We've also got commitments from Altarian science vessels and a wing of Centauri scouts. It seems your refugee network has grown into something resembling an alliance.
An alliance, Marcus repeated slowly.
Against the Preservation Alliance.
For the protection of free thought and cultural exchange, Admiral Chen corrected. The Galactic Commerce Authority is calling it the most significant political development in centuries.
Captain Velnotha's image appeared alongside Admiral Chen's.
The intelligence my ships can provide will be crucial for protecting refugee operations and planning countermoves against alliance activities.
Zara looked around the bridge at her crewmates, humans who had started as simple traders and were now part of something that was reshaping galactic politics.
What do we call ourselves? She asked.
If we're an alliance, we need a name.
I've got a suggestion, Jackson said from his station.
The Free Thought Coalition.
Because that's what this is really about, protecting the right to think differently. The Free Thought Coalition, Chen repeated, testing the words.
I like it. It says exactly what we stand for. Signal from Meridian Station, Sarah announced.
Dr. Martinez reports successful processing of all incoming refugees, and requests guidance on expanding facility capacity. Tell her to prepare for a significant increase in operations, Chen said.
It looks like we're about to get very busy.
As the various ships in their growing fleet began coordinating defensive positions and information-sharing protocols, Zara found herself thinking about how far she'd come from that desperate exile on Kepler Station. She'd been looking for a place to belong, but had somehow ended up helping create a place where everyone could belong. Zara, Chen said, approaching her station, I want you to take point on refugee integration operations. You understand what these people are going through better than anyone else, and you've got the diplomatic skills to work with multiple species.
Me? Zara asked, surprised. Captain, I'm just a former exile. I don't know anything about running a coalition.
You know the most important thing, Chen replied with a smile. You know what it feels like to be alone and afraid, and you know what it means to find people who won't abandon you.
He gestured to the fleet forming around them. That's what this is all about.
Making sure nobody has to be alone and afraid just for thinking differently. On the main screen, Admiral Chen was coordinating with military officers from half a dozen different species, while Captain Velnoth provided intelligence briefings to coalition commanders. It was chaos and coordination and cooperation on a scale that the galaxy had never seen before.
Signal from the Altarian science vessel, Lin reported. They're requesting permission to share their research on multi-species cooperation protocols. Granted, Chen said.
Tell them we're very interested in anything that helps different species work together more effectively.
Signal from the Croton heavy cruiser, Sarah added.
They want to know if we're interested in joint training exercises for defensive operations.
Also granted, Chen replied. It looks like we're going to need all the defensive capability we can get. As the afternoon progressed, more ships arrived at their rendezvous point.
Each brought refugees, resources, and personnel committed to the coalition's mission. It was becoming clear that what had started as a human captain helping one exile had grown into something that might actually be able to challenge the Preservation Alliance's vision of galactic cultural purity.
Zara, Jorik said quietly, approaching her station, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never asked those questions that got you exiled? Zara considered the question, watching the organized chaos of species learning to work together for a common cause.
Sometimes, she admitted.
But, then, I remember that asking questions led me here. To these people. To this purpose. She smiled. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even if it means we're probably going to end up fighting a war against the most conservative factions in the galaxy?
Especially then, Zara said firmly. Because if we don't fight for the right to think freely, who will? On the main screen, Admiral Chen was announcing the formal establishment of the Free Thought Coalition, with representatives from 12 different species signing cooperation agreements. It was messy, improvised, and completely unprecedented. It was also the most hopeful thing Zara had ever been part of.
Signal from Meridian Station, Sarah reported.
They're requesting coalition fleet designation codes for our ships.
Assign them, Chen ordered. We're official now.
As the Wanderer's Hope received its new designation as Coalition Vessel Wanderer's Hope, Zara realized that she was no longer an exile. She was a founding member of an alliance dedicated to protecting the right of all beings to question, learn, and grow.
It was a very human idea.
And, as she'd learned, that was exactly what made it so powerful. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, no longer representing exile and loneliness but possibility and hope. Somewhere out there, the Preservation Alliance was planning their next move against free thought and cultural exchange. But they would find the galaxy a very different place than they expected. Because when humans decided someone belonged, they didn't just protect that person, they protected the principle that everyone deserved to belong somewhere. And that principle, Zara had learned, was worth fighting for.